In 1976, Americans were celebrating the Bicentennial. 200 years of freedom, right? Then a government report dropped. At least 3,406 Indigenous women were sterilized without consent, coerced during childbirth, lied to, threatened, some just 15 years old. The real number is even higher. Studies say up to 50% of Native women of childbearing age in the 1970s. I like to start every season of a new year by looking back. There are just so many things that have happened in the past that are worth thinking about, and they help us with context both for today and in the future. Part one of this story was the enactment of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act, a remarkable piece of legislation. My mentor, Forrest Gerard, Blackfeet, worked on Capitol Hill and was a primary author. He later told me that the bill was the capstone of his career. And that's telling, because Gerard did a lot in the field of federal Indian policy. Before I go on, do me a favor. We're at the Indigenous House channel on YouTube. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet. And for all of my content, go ahead and subscribe at my Substack. It's free. marktrahant.substack.com. In its annual report, the Native American Rights Fund called 1976 a year of decision. That was the good news. In 1976, I was the editor of our tribal newspaper, the Shoban News, and I remember meeting with people from Power County, Idaho. These folks owned land on the reservation, but felt excluded because the tribe, not their county, had the authority to zone their land. They did not like not having a say. In 1976, there was a growing attitude in communities on or even near tribal nations against any tribal authority. We called that movement the Backlash. In its annual report, the Native American Rights Fund described a few legal victories by tribes. The immediate effect that the year 1976 has had on Indian affairs is one of rethinking the overall strategy. With every key victory in the courts, there has been an ever-increasing backlash. That backlash was promoted by organizations with names that suggested a noble calling: South Dakotans for Civil Liberties, Montanans Opposed to Discrimination, and the largest, the Interstate Congress for Equal Rights and Responsibility, or ICER. These groups defined American Indians as special citizens who, because of treaty rights, were getting a deal that was better than everybody else. One book, Indian Treaties, America's Nightmare, was sent to members of Congress, the Secretary of the Interior, and other Washington officials. Quote, "The liberal treatment of minorities has reached unheard of proportions in denying equal rights to all citizens of our so-called democracy," the book said. Sportsmen's organizations, fishermen, hunters, landowners, commercial fishermen, and just plain tax-paying citizens who've just about had it with the Indian takeovers make up the membership of ICER. The backlash was a nationwide movement. Sorry. Okay, Louie. Louie? The backlash was a nationwide movement that discounted 2 centuries of federal Indian policy. That the Indians' claims are being given any legitimacy at all is nonsensical, wrote a columnist in the Boston Herald-American about the land claims in Maine. Whatever happened 200 years ago, the culprits were not the current landowners, so there is no justification for punishing them. The movement had one goal: abrogate treaties. These efforts were on 2 legislative tracks. The first was led by U.S. Representative Jack Cunningham, a Republican from Washington, who introduced bill after bill calling for treaty abrogation. The second track was more moderate legislation that was introduced by U.S. Representative Lloyd Meads, Democrat from Washington. His role was interesting because he had once been a supporter of tribes and even won an award from the National Congress of American Indians for his work on the Hill. The group ICER called for a choice between being a treaty American or a first-class citizen. Until they decide what they want to be, treaty American or first-class citizen, they will feel the bite of the backlash, and it will get stronger until a more equitable solution is found. The newspaper Wasaha covered the annual convention of the anti-treaty group, and the members clearly favored Cunningham's quick fix. But one of the leaders said Meads represented the first step toward abrogation of treaties. Wasaha and most tribal newspapers devoted a lot of space and attention to this backlash movement. Tribal leaders saw the threat and worked to build coalitions to defeat the ideas behind the backlash, as well as their representatives in Congress. But discourse was launched, and tribal leaders developed a successful strategy. In Washington state, for example, a ballot referendum called for treaty abrogation. But the tribes made a political case to voters and defeated the measure. At the same time, a similar coalition defeated Cunningham and other opponents of tribes. The termination era, as well as the backlash era, were interesting because the language used against tribal rights was so well cloaked. Termination supporters wanted to free the Indians. The Interstate Congress proclaimed the goal of equal rights. What drove a lot of this in large part was competition over scarce natural resources. All the tribes that were terminated had a resource that someone wanted, often timber or salmon. So the so-called equal rights efforts by the Interstate Congress was led by hunters and fishers who objected to preferential rights of treaty hunting and fishing. The ICER folks weren't the only voices about treaties in 1976. A caravan led by the American Indian Movement brought people from across the country to Washington, D.C. While some Americans were celebrating the Bicentennial of the Declaration of Independence, the Self-Determination Caravan called on the United States to live up to its promises. That included a 20-points program that framed the previous trail of broken treaties in 1972. The goal was to get the federal government to honor its word to Native peoples and to replace the Bureau of Indian Affairs with a government agency elected for and by Indian people. An exhibit by the National Park Service warned about a critical point in time because so many of the nation's resources, coal, oil, and timber, were located on tribal lands in the West. President Ford did not take the time to meet with the caravan, but a few weeks later he met with some 200 leaders at the White House. An official White House statement said it was the first time a president of the United States had met with such a broad representation of the Indian leadership. This is a historic occasion, Indian Affairs Commissioner Maury Thompson said. President Ford has invited the chairman of major tribes and leaders of national Indian organizations to meet with him so that he can personally express to them his support for their efforts under the administration's policy of Indian self-determination. That same year, another branch of the government released a tragic report that uncovered sanctioned sterilization of Indigenous women. The General Accounting Office found that at least 3,406 American Indian women were sterilized during this era without their consent. The total number is likely much higher, with some independent studies by Native American physicians estimating that between 25 and 50% of all Native women of childbearing age were sterilized in the 1970s. The probe also found that at least 36 women under the age of 21 were sterilized, despite a court-ordered moratorium on sterilizations for women in that age group unless medically necessary for reasons other than contraception. The GAO found that women were often coerced into signing consent forms under duress, sometimes during childbirth, under the influence of painkillers, or under the threat of losing benefits. In some cases, women were told the procedure was reversible or part of another operation, like an appendectomy or having your tonsils removed. One more story about 1976, the election campaign. What was remarkable is how invested Native people were in the campaigns and later in the administration. As I mentioned in our last show, Washington Senator Henry Jackson, his candidacy was a story about redemption. He was a long-term supporter of termination. He viewed in the context of his background. He was the son of Norwegian immigrants. He saw assimilation as a logical next step. Blend in, be American, that sort of thing. He championed termination while he was in the House, and he continued that path while he was in the Senate. But some of his colleagues suggested he look at tribal relations again if he was serious about trying to be president. Seattle physician Abe Bergman, who often worked in Native clinics, urged Jackson to not only get on the rights of history, but to reach out to tribal communities in his campaign. As I wrote in my book, The Last Great Battle of the Indian Wars, Jackson reversed his policy. He hired Forrest Gerard as a professional staff member and championed the most significant legislation of the 1970s, the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act, the Indian Finance Act. He changed the very nature of policy discussions. To me, this is a story about what a candidate can be, not what they are now. If Jackson ran in the age of social media, his candidacy would have been dismissed. Terminationist, end of story. The most inspiring candidate in 1976 and the most knowledgeable about American Indians and Alaska Native issues was Representative Morris Udall of Arizona. Udall wrote about his failed enterprise in his book, Too Funny to Be President. After one of the primary elections where Udall came up short, he said, "The people have spoken, the bastards." Franklin Duchesneau, Cheyenne River, who worked with Udall on the House Interior Committee for many years, once told me, "He was a great man. I don't know what kind of president he would have been, but he sure was a great man." Suzanne Hardrow worked for the Jimmy Carter campaign in 1976, and she organized a meeting with tribal leaders. She later told Cultural Survival that Carter pledged to sign the act into law, along with the Indian Child Welfare Act, Tribally Controlled Community College Act, Eastern Land Claim Settlement, and other federal legislation. I have to point out that he made a lot of promises to Indians, and he kept them all, and that's what politics is about, even today. I'm Mark Trahant, and this is Breaking History.